The loading dock alarm had been screaming for 11 seconds before anyone realized it wasn't a drill. Mace Duval heard it from inside Cargo Bay 7, where he was elbow-deep in the guts of a malfunctioning environmental regulator, and he counted the pulses the way a man who'd spent 8 years on deep freight haulers learned to count pulses: 2 short, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long. Not a pressure breach, not a vacuum seal failure, not even the gut-dropping triple pulse that meant fire. 2 short, 1 long was the biological containment alarm. Something had come aboard Vethara Station that wasn't on any manifest. He pulled his arm out of the regulator housing, wiped coolant off his forearm with a rag that was already black with 3 other kinds of grease, and listened. The alarm kept going. Then, over the top of it, he heard something else, a sound he hadn't expected to hear on a commercial transit hub orbiting a gas giant 60 light-years from Earth. A chorus of alien voices, dozens of them, rising in what he recognized as the universal language of genuine panic. They were running. Mace set down his wrench, picked up the small handheld diagnostic tool clipped to his belt out of habit rather than any sense that it would help, and walked to the cargo bay's main door. Through the thick polymer viewport, he could see the main corridor of docking ring 4. He could see Cathari workers, the gray-skinned, six-limbed dock crew he'd spent the last 4 months working alongside, sprinting past in both directions. He could see 2 Voreth customs officers, who never moved faster than a slow, dignified walk, absolutely booking it toward the sealed emergency bulkhead at the corridor's far end. He could see a Pellish transit coordinator, an alien whose species was famous throughout the Confederation for its absolute composure in crisis situations, for whom the phrase, keeping a cool head, had been coined by 3 separate xenolinguists, standing flat against the far wall with all 4 of its sensing antennae pressed back against its skull, which was the Pellish equivalent of screaming. Mace opened the cargo bay door. The corridor hit him with sound first, the alarm, the running feet on metal decking, a low vibrating keen from somewhere farther down the dock that he felt more than heard, like a subsonic note that found the bottom of his sternum and pressed on it. The air was different too. Something had changed the chemical signature of the recycled station air, added a note that was sharp and musky and old in a way that made the back of his neck prickle. He turned toward the sound. 50 meters down the corridor, past the abandoned customs station and the overturned utility cart that someone had knocked over while running, past the scattered data tablets and personal items that evacuating station workers had dropped without stopping to retrieve, something was sitting in the middle of the floor. It was big, not enormous, not the kind of big that filled a room, but the kind of big that made a corridor feel suddenly inadequate. It sat on 6 haunches that were folded against its body in a way that suggested it could go from sitting to full sprint in approximately 0 time. Its hide was a deep iridescent black that shifted toward purple in the harsh overhead lighting, and it was covered in overlapping scale plates that Mace recognized immediately, the way you'd recognize the shape of something you'd read about but never expected to actually see. 4 of what might have been arms were folded against its chest, tipped with recurved claws that were each about as long as his forearm. Its head was wide and low-set on a thick neck, and its face, if you could call it that, was a complex arrangement of sensory pits and folded cartilage and 2 sets of eyes, an outer ring of 6 amber eyes and an inner pair of deep, pupil-less black ones, and all 8 of them were aimed directly at Mace. He knew what it was. Every freight hauler working the Confederation's outer transit lanes knew what they were, the same way every sailor in the old deep ocean trade routes had known about certain kinds of weather. You learned the shape of dangerous things. The Vareth called void predators in some of the older human translations of Confederation xenobiology texts, called screaming death in several alien languages, were apex hunters native to a planet so inhospitable that even Confederation military forces only went there in serious numbers. Adults were 4 meters at the shoulder, and had been documented killing military-grade survey vehicles for sport. They were one of maybe 6 species in the known galaxy that was formally classified as an unrestricted existential threat to any unarmored life form. They were also, Mace had read in a dog-eared copy of Hartley's Comparative Xenobiology, 3rd edition, highly social pack animals with extremely complex behavioral hierarchies, and their juveniles went through a well-documented phase of environmental exploration that involved wandering away from the pack territory and investigating new spaces. The juveniles were approximately the size of a large terrestrial predator, say, a lion, and they were, according to Hartley, identifiable by the specific arrangement of their scale plates, which in adults were fully locked but in juveniles had visible gaps along the dorsal ridge. Mace looked at the thing's back. He could see the gaps. He looked at its face. All 8 eyes were still on him, but it hadn't moved. In the absence of screaming station workers to react to, it seemed to have redirected its attention, and what he read in its posture, the weight shifted back onto its rear haunches, the forward limbs slightly drawn in, the head low rather than raised, wasn't aggression. He'd grown up on a working cattle ranch in the flat middle of Montana, where the winters came hard and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, and where his father had kept, at various points in Mace's childhood, horses, cattle, 2 different pairs of working dogs, a family of feral barn cats that had developed into something approaching a separate civilization, a red-tailed hawk that had been injured and then simply refused to leave, and for about 8 months when Mace was 11, a wolf pup that his father had found abandoned, and that they'd raised until it was old enough to survive on its own. Mace had spent more of his childhood around animals than around other children, and he had developed, the way children develop things in the absence of alternatives, an intuitive read of animal behavior that no amount of xenobiology textbooks could have given him. What he was reading right now was lost, stressed, young, alone. Not aggressive, scared. He took a slow breath, then he took 1 step forward. From somewhere behind him, from the direction of the sealed emergency bulkhead, where every station worker with any sense had retreated, he heard a voice. Specifically, the translated voice of who he'd later learn was Station Commander Vethai's, broadcasting over the emergency comm channel in 6 languages simultaneously. The Confederation Standard Version said, "All personnel, this is a mandatory evacuation notice. A Class 1 biological containment event has been detected on Docking Ring 4. All personnel are to proceed immediately to sealed emergency zones. Containment response teams have been notified. Do not approach the entity. I repeat, do not." Mace took another step forward. The Varith cub's head dropped slightly lower. Its forward limbs uncurled just a fraction. The amber outer eyes tracked him. The inner black eyes stayed fixed. He thought about the wolf pup, which had been named Dusk by his mother, and then subsequently called about 40 other names by his father, none of which were printable. He thought about the first time he'd approached it in the barn, how it had been trembling with cold and stress, how it had shown its teeth not because it wanted to attack but because showing teeth was the only defense it had. He thought about how you approached something scared. You moved slow. You kept your body low and your hands visible. You made noise, not threatening noise, not the sharp sounds of alarm or aggression, but the steady, unalarmed sounds of a creature that had no reason to be afraid. A hum, a whistle. Something that said, "I am not scared of you, and therefore there is nothing to be scared of." He put 2 fingers to his lips and whistled. It wasn't a particularly impressive whistle. It was the same whistle he used when he was working through a complicated repair problem, a kind of tuneless, wandering sound that he was barely aware he was making most of the time. His crew chief on the Belladonna run had once told him it was the most annoying habit she'd ever encountered in 40 years of hauling freight, because it meant he was thinking, which meant something was broken, which meant her margins were about to suffer. He whistled and walked. 30 meters, 25. The Varith cub was absolutely still, all 8 eyes on him. The only movement was a subtle shift in the way the scale plates along its dorsal ridge were arrayed. Mace didn't know what that meant specifically, but he'd once watched a cat's fur flatten down after about 10 minutes of careful, patient approach, and he thought it looked similar. 20 meters. Somewhere above him, on the observation level of the docking ring, he became dimly aware of a growing collection of aliens pressed against the viewport windows, watching. He ignored them. 15. The cub made a sound. Not the subsonic keen he'd felt in his chest earlier, something higher, something that had a break in the middle of it, like a question that couldn't find its own ending. May stopped walking, he crouched down. Not all the way to the floor, he wasn't going to make himself small, because small meant prey, but enough to reduce his height, to make the angle of his gaze level rather than above. He kept whistling. The cub's forward limbs touched the floor. It moved toward him. Not fast, slow, in the careful, deliberate way of a young thing that was investigating something novel, each of its 6 limbs placed with deliberate care, its head extended forward on that thick neck, the sensory pits along its face working the air between them in rapid, flickering motions. It crossed the last 15 meters in about 30 seconds. It stopped half a meter away. Up close it smelled like ozone and iron and something deeper, something that Mace's hindbrain flagged as dangerous before his conscious mind could override it. He felt his heartbeat kick up. He kept whistling. The cub extended its head the last half meter and touched its sensory pits to his knee. He felt the contact through his work pants, warm, slightly wet, vibrating at a frequency that was more felt than heard. He didn't move. After about 5 seconds, the cub sat back on its haunches in a posture that was so nearly identical to a dog settling down that Mace almost laughed. He let the whistle trail off. "Okay," he said quietly, "there you go." He straightened up slowly, and the cub's eyes tracked him, but it didn't move. He turned sideways to it, not showing his back, not squaring to face it, and after another moment he started walking slowly toward the emergency bulkhead at the far end of the corridor. He got about 10 steps before he heard the sound of 6 limbs on metal decking behind him. He looked back. The cub was following him. He turned back to the emergency bulkhead, raised his hand, and knocked on it twice. There was a very long pause. Then a small viewport in the bulkhead slid open, and a pair of Cathari eyes, wide, gold-irised, currently maximally dilated, looked through it at him, and then past him at the thing sitting behind him. "Open the door," Mace said. The viewport closed. There was a longer pause. Then the bulkhead unsealed with the heavy mechanical sound of security locks disengaging, and slid open about 2 meters, the minimum that it could open and still constitute being open, and Mace walked through it. The cub followed him through it. The sound that came from approximately 60 station workers simultaneously discovering that the apex predator was now in the same sealed safe zone as them was the kind of sound that Mace suspected he would hear in his dreams for some years to come. There was a secondary evacuation. It happened extremely fast. The cub sat down and watched them go with what Mace had already started privately thinking of as an expression of mild, academic interest. Station Commander Vethais was a Cathari, which meant she was tall, gray-skinned, 6-limbed, possessed of an extremely good poker face that was currently working overtime, and absolutely furious in the controlled, quiet way that Cathari expressed absolute fury, which was to say that 2 of her 6 limbs were very slightly stiffer than the other 4, and her speaking membranes were vibrating at about 1 cycle per second faster than her normal conversational baseline. She stood on the far side of what was now being called, in the improvised emergency coordination center that had been set up in Bay 9, the safety perimeter, which was a yellow line that someone had drawn on the floor with emergency marking tape at a distance of 12 meters from where Mace was sitting on an equipment crate. The Vareth cub was lying on the floor next to him with its head resting on two of its forward limbs, in a position that strongly resembled a very large, very armored dog that had decided it was taking a nap and was not interested in any further discussion on the matter. "You will explain," Commander Vethai said, in Confederation Standard, "how you are still alive." "Same way I always stay alive," Mace said. "I pay attention." This did not appear to satisfy her. Behind her, pressed against the far wall of Bay 9 in a cluster that included the two Vorath customs officers, the Pelish Transit Coordinator, who had regained its composure and was now recording everything with 3 separate devices simultaneously, which was apparently a Pelish stress response, and about 40 other station workers from 8 different species. There was a quality of silence that Mace associated with audiences at very tense sporting events. "That animal," Commander Vethai said, "is a Vareth subadult, a Class 1 predator. Its adults have killed armored survey vehicles. The containment response team that has been scrambled from Sector Command will arrive in approximately 6 hours. In those 6 hours, this station will require a plan for ensuring that that animal does not kill everyone currently on it." "It's not going to kill anyone," Mace said. The silence in the room went from tense to a specific kind of tense that comes from 60 beings all having the same thought simultaneously, and none of them wanting to be the first one to say it. "It is a Vareth," Commander Vethai said, with the patient emphasis of someone explaining a self-evident truth to a being who has perhaps suffered a head injury. "They are existential threats to unarmored." "Adults are," Mace said. "This one's young. Probably separated from its pack during transit. You get Vareth pack territories overlapping some of the outer shipping corridors. I've heard of this happening before, usually with juveniles. They go through an exploration phase. It's in Hartley." He looked at the cub, which had opened its inner pair of eyes and was watching the conversation with the specific quality of attention of a being that understands a discussion is happening about it without understanding the content. "It's stressed. It's lost. It needs a pack signal and it's not getting one. That's why it's staying close to me. I'm giving off something it's reading as stable. As long as no one panics around it, it's not going to." "How?" said a Vorath customs officer from the back of the room, in a voice from which approximately all effect had been removed. "Do you know any of this?" "I grew up with animals," Mace said. The customs officer processed this. "You are a freight hauler." "I'm a cargo systems technician," Mace said, with a faint, involuntary correction reflex. "But yeah, before that, ranch kid from Montana." The word Montana didn't mean anything to anyone in the room who wasn't human, but the concept of ranch kid landed somewhere, because the way he'd said it had a texture to it that translated across species lines, the specific quality of a person describing a formative condition rather than a job title. "The containment team," Commander Vethai said, in a tone of someone who had decided to stay focused on logistics, "will have equipment to secure the animal. In the meantime, you are suggesting that you can keep it calm." "I'm not suggesting anything," Mace said. "I already did it. I'm just saying it'll stay calm as long as people don't freak out around it." "And if people freak out around it?" someone asked from the crowd. Mace considered how to answer that. "Have you ever seen a spooked horse in an enclosed space?" The question was rhetorical. He was fairly confident no one in the room except him had ever seen a horse at all. But the phrase, spooked animal in an enclosed space, was apparently universal enough in concept that it landed. The silence quality shifted again, this time to something that he'd describe as collective determination to not freak out. "All right," Commander Vethai said. She was a good station commander, Mace thought. She'd gotten to the pragmatic position faster than most would have. "You will remain with the animal. You will tell us immediately if its behavior changes. We will reroute station personnel away from this bay for the next 6 hours and wait for the containment team." Mace nodded. "The Pelish coordinator is requesting permission to observe from a distance of no less than 20 meters for documentation purposes. Mace looked at the Pellish coordinator, whose 4 antennae were now fully extended and quivering with the specific frequency that he'd learned. Over 4 months of working alongside them meant extremely interested. "Sure," he said. "Tell it to move slow and not make any sudden sounds." The Pellish coordinator was told this via the commander's communicator. Its antennae went into a configuration that Mace had never seen before, which he later learned was the Pellish equivalent of barely suppressed scientific excitement. The 6 hours were long and quiet in the particular way that long, quiet hours get when they're the eye of a crisis, rather than genuine peace. Mace sat on his equipment crate, and the Vareth cub lay beside him, and every 40 minutes or so the cub would get up, range out to about 15 meters in various directions, investigate things with its sensory pits. The overturned utility cart got a thorough examination. So did the environmental regulator housing Mace had been working on when the alarm went off, which the cub approached, sniffed at for about 2 minutes, then sat back and regarded with what Mace could have sworn was critical assessment, and then return and resettle beside him. During the second ranging expedition, he found his diagnostic tool had fallen off his belt during the initial walk down the corridor. He picked it up off the floor and clipped it back. During the third expedition, the cub found the tool more interesting than the regulator and carried it back to the crate in one of its forward limbs and deposited it in front of Mace with a very clear expectation that this item would now be explained. Mace took the diagnostic tool, turned it on, and ran a scan on the nearest bulkhead. The tool emitted a soft series of tones as it worked. The cub's sensory pits worked rapidly as it processed the sound. He ran another scan, and another. By the 4th scan, the cub had its head on his knee. He sat there with 8 alien eyes tracking the small screen of the diagnostic tool, while he ran inventory checks on systems he had no actual reason to check, because they were all functioning fine and had been functioning fine for 4 months. And he thought about his father, who had never been a man of many words but who had been, in certain specific situations, extremely wise. The situation his father's wisdom applied to most directly right now was how to sit with a frightened thing until it wasn't frightened anymore. His father had a phrase for it that Mace had taken a long time to understand as a child. You had to be the calm, not perform calm, not demonstrate calm, not issue calm in the form of slow movements and quiet voices as a kind of theater. You had to actually be it, down in the body, down in the heartbeat. Animals knew the difference. His father had said this about horses, about cattle, about the wolf pup, about the hawk, about every scared creature that had come through their lives. They always knew. He thought about the look on the Pellish coordinator's face, the antennae configuration, the 3 recording devices, and he thought about the cluster of alien workers pressed against the bay wall, watching him with a quality of attention that wasn't just relief or curiosity, but something that had more weight to it, something that was trying to make sense of what it was seeing. He ran another scan. The cub made the broken question sound again, softly, and he answered it with the tuneless whistle. The containment team arrived at hour 5 and 40 minutes, which Mace considered relatively impressive given the scramble distance. There were 8 of them, in Confederation military-grade environmental suits, carrying equipment he recognized from Hartley's illustrations: field emitters, wide-spectrum sedation dispersers, containment harnesses rated for Class 1 biological threats. They staged at the Bay 9 entrance, and their commander, a Meridian, which was a species Mace had met exactly twice before and both times found unsettling in a way he couldn't fully articulate, spent about 3 minutes at the safety perimeter line talking to Commander Vethais in a low voice, after which Commander Vethais came to talk to Mace. "The containment team commander wants to deploy sedation dispersers," she said. Mace looked at the cub, which had gotten up at the arrival of the new group and was standing, all 6 limbs set, watching the containment team with a quality of attention that was different from anything he'd seen from it in the last 6 hours. "If they activate the dispersers from that distance," May said carefully, "before it's had any chance to assess and settle on them, it's going to move. The dispersers would sedate it before. They'd have to be within 8 meters for the dispersers to work fast enough," Mace said. Hartley, Chapter 9. Varith Metabolic Rate. You need proximity. And to get proximity, you need to walk toward it, which it will read as a threat approach, and it'll move before the dispersers reach full saturation. Commander Vethais looked at the cub, then at the containment team. "What do you suggest?" "Give me the harness," Mace said. "I'll put it on." There was a pause. "You will place a Class 1 biological containment harness on a Varith subadult yourself." "It's been next to me for 6 hours," Mace said. "It's been on my knee twice. If I walk toward it right now, it's not going to move. If 8 people in containment suits who smell like recycled military gear and discharge residue walk toward it right now, it'll move, and then someone's going to get hurt trying to stop it from moving, and then it's going to get scared, and then someone's going to get killed. That's how this goes if we do it the right way." "That," Commander Vethais said, "is not the right way. The right way is the containment team. That is what they are for." "I know," Mace said, "but it's not going to work right now. Not with this animal in this situation, with 6 hours of me being the only stable thing in its environment. You need to give it a transition." She looked at him for a long time. He had the feeling she was running some internal calculation that had a lot of variables, most of them legal. "If you are harmed," she said finally, "you understand that the station's liability." "I'm not going to be harmed," he said. "You cannot know that." "No," he agreed, "but I'm telling you anyway." Another long look. Then she turned and went back to the containment team commander. Mace watched the conversation, couldn't hear it, could read fragments of it in body language. The Meridian containment commander had a quality of stillness that he associated with people who were very good at their jobs and were currently listening to someone describe a procedure that violated their standard operating procedure and were trying to decide whether the deviation was sane. He watched the Meridian look at the cub, then at Mace, then at the cub again. Some kind of assessment happening. After 4 minutes, a member of the containment team walked to the safety perimeter line and held out the harness. It was about the size of a large dog's body harness, made of something that looked like braided filament and was probably capable of restraining something considerably larger than it appeared. It had activation patches on 3 points. Mace took it. He looked at the configuration for a moment, memorizing it, where the patches were, how the primary buckles worked, the order of attachment. Then he turned to face the cub. It was watching him, all 8 eyes. The inner pair had an intensity to them now that was different from the settled attention of the last few hours. It had registered the new group of arrivals, and it was maintaining a kind of alert readiness that he recognized as the animal equivalent of not entirely relaxed, but not yet committed to a response. He started walking toward it, slow, the whistle low. The cub's attention shifted to the harness in his hands. The sensory pits worked rapidly. He kept walking, 12 meters, 10. The cub dropped its head to smell the harness from 2 meters away without him needing to extend it, stretched its neck out in that curious, careful way, the scale plates along its dorsal ridge doing the slight shifting that he'd started reading as a settling response. It smelled the harness for a long time, then it looked up at him. He crouched very slowly and held the harness open. The cub stepped through it. He'd never put a Varith containment harness on anything before. He'd never put a harness on anything with that particular arrangement of limbs and body mass and scale plate geometry. He worked it slowly, checking the configuration against what he'd memorized, and the cub stood absolutely still throughout, except once when one of the buckles touched the gap in its dorsal scale plates, and it twitched and made a sharp sound, and he stopped moving for a full 30 seconds until it settled. Then he finished. He activated the 3 patches in the order, indicated by the small indicator markings on each one. He stood up and stepped back. The cub sat down. The harness didn't seem to distress it. The design, he assumed, was intended to be unobtrusive enough that the animal could be led into proper containment rather than simply dropped where it stood. From behind the safety perimeter, there was a sound he'd never heard from a group of 60-plus alien station workers before. He couldn't name it in any language. It wasn't applause. None of the species present used applause in any meaningful way. It was more a collective exhalation, a simultaneous release of held breath. He heard it the way you heard a pressure change, felt it somewhere behind the sternum. He turned around. The containment team was already moving toward him in careful, measured steps, the team commander leading. Mace stepped aside to give them clear access to the cub, and as the first team member reached the harness's guide point, and the cub registered the new contact, and in a moment that made every alien in the room go very still, simply accepted it, he heard someone from the cluster of station workers say something in a language he didn't speak. He looked toward Commander Vethais. "The Pelish coordinator," she said carefully, "is asking if it may speak with you." "Sure," Mace said. The Pelish coordinator had apparently been waiting for exactly this, because it crossed the distance between the wall and where Mace was standing in a time that suggested it had been ready to move for approximately the last 4 hours. Up close, the Pelish were impressive in a way that wasn't immediately obvious at a distance. They were tall, bilaterally symmetrical in a way that looked almost human, until you counted limbs or noticed the specific geometry of their head. And their antennae, when fully extended as they were now, had a presence to them, a quality of directed attention that was almost physical. All 4 antennae were aimed at him. "I have," the coordinator said, in Confederation standard that had the precise, slightly over-articulated quality of someone speaking a second language very carefully, "been recording this event for documentation. You understand that this will be a significant document." "I kind of figured," Mace said. "I need to ask you something for the record." A pause, the antennae shifting. "What is the word for what you did?" Mace thought about it. "In my language, handling maybe, or just working with animals." "These are not words the record will understand," the coordinator said. "Not the way the record needs to understand them. I have 23 hours of footage from this station's archive. I have Vareth incident reports from 11 Confederation worlds. In every incident report, the response protocol is the same: containment teams, evacuation, sedation, and removal. There is no record of a single individual of any species approaching a Vareth subadult and sitting beside it for 6 hours and then placing a containment harness on it by hand." Another pause. "The record will need to call this something." Mace looked at the Pelish coordinator. He looked at the recording devices. He looked at the cub, which was now being guided calmly toward the transport containment unit by the containment team, all 8 eyes still watching him over its shoulder. "You could just call it paying attention," he said. The antennae configuration changed to the one he didn't have a name for yet. The incident report filed by Station Commander Vethais was 17 pages long and made its way through the Confederation's standard bureaucratic channels to the Xenobiological Incident Registry, where it was logged under case file VTH 2281 and assigned a review priority of urgent, which in the registry's workflow meant it would be reviewed within 6 weeks. By that time, the Pelish coordinator's documentation had already been indexed by every major Confederation information network and had been accessed approximately 14 million times, which was by some margin a new record for an incident of this classification. The documentation showed, among other things, the following: a single human male walking down an empty corridor toward a Vareth subadult without protective equipment or weapons, the whistle, the crouching approach, the moment of contact, 6 hours in a cargo bay, the human and the Vareth cub, the diagnostic tool running scans that no one needed while the tones played and the cub's sensory pits worked. The harness. The cub stepping into it. What the documentation also showed, what the Pellish coordinator, who turned out to be a xenosociologist on an 18-month research fellowship, considered the most significant element of the entire record, was the moment the cub stepped through the harness. The coordinator had been recording from 20 meters away. The image quality was very high, and what you could see in the moment the human stood up and stepped back after activating the patches was his face, not performing anything, not managing anything. Just the face of a person who had done a thing that needed doing and watched it complete, and somewhere in the expression, in the area around the eyes, something that looked, the coordinator wrote in the final analysis, after considerable deliberation over the translation, like the quiet satisfaction of a competent being in the presence of an outcome that had gone, against substantial odds, exactly the way it was supposed to go. The coordinator's analysis, published 8 weeks later in the Confederation's leading xenobehavioral journal, was titled, Calibrated Interspecies Stability, a single-instance field study of human behavioral intuition applied to Class 1 predator management. It was 7,000 words long and included 23 pages of appendices. The abstract read in part, we document an instance in which an adult male human, Homo sapiens, Confederation observer status, without specialized training or equipment, successfully de-escalated and manually harnessed a Vareth Varix Vorithani, subadult following its unauthorized transit aboard a commercial space station. The human's approach relied entirely on behavioral reading and calibrated response rather than technological intervention. We propose that this incident constitutes a data point of significant interest in the ongoing debate regarding the scope and nature of human interspecies intuition, a faculty which our data suggests may be substantially more sophisticated and applicable across a wider range of species than previously theorized, than existing Confederation xenopsychology literature acknowledges. The report did not become the most widely discussed xenobehavioral paper of the year because of the 7,000 words or the 23 pages of appendices. It became the most widely discussed xenobehavioral paper of the year because of the footage, and because of the thing the footage showed that no amount of academic language could fully account for. An apex predator, a creature that the Confederation's threat classification system listed without qualification as one of the most dangerous organisms in the known galaxy, sitting on the floor of a cargo bay with its head on a human's knee, while the human ran diagnostic scans on a malfunctioning environmental regulator for no apparent reason, except that it was something to do. And the creature's 8 eyes soft and its scale plates settled, and its body carrying the unmistakable quality of a frightened thing that had, against all expectation, found something to trust. Mace found out about the paper 4 weeks after the incident, when Commander Vethais called him into her office and handed him a data tablet with the abstract on it. He read it again. The Pellish coordinator wants to interview you formally, she said. I talked to it for 10 minutes, Mace said. Yes, it would like to talk to you for significantly longer. It has been informed that you are contracted through the end of the seasonal freight cycle, which means 6 more months, Mace said. Yes, the coordinator's fellowship also runs 6 more months. It would like to propose a study arrangement. You would continue your normal duties, and it would observe and document instances in which you interact with non-human life forms and... I'm a cargo systems technician, Mace said. Yes, Commander Vethais said, I am aware. A pause. This station has approximately 240 non-human personnel, she said, and freight animals in transit housing on Docking Ring 2 at any given time, and occasionally unexpected biological arrivals. Mace looked at the abstract again. He looked at the phrase calibrated interspecies stability and thought about what that meant, reduced to its actual content, which was a scared animal and a man from Montana who hadn't thought of anything smarter to do than sit down and whistle. "I'll talk to the coordinator," he said. "There is one other thing," Commander Vethai said. She was back to her controlled, careful Cathari effect, but he'd gotten good at reading the secondary indicators over the last 4 months, and the 2 degrees stiffer limbs were doing something different now than they'd done in the cargo bay. He thought it might be the equivalent of working up to something. "The Vareth subadult," she said. "The containment team transported it to the Species Rehabilitation Reserve at Sector Station 9. Standard procedure. They will attempt pack reintegration." A pause. The team commander filed a secondary notation in the transport record. The animal displayed elevated stress indicators throughout the transport. Elevated but manageable. The team commander attributed the manageability to something called a scent anchor. Apparently it retained a sufficient olfactory trace from its 6 hours in Bay 9 to maintain a baseline calm. The notation states that the animal should be considered. She checked the data tablet in her other hand. A strong candidate for successful reintegration, contingent on reduced transport duration, and the continued availability of the identified scent anchor during the initial reserve adjustment period. Mace looked at her. "The team commander," Commander Vethai said carefully, "included a formal request that the, quote, human cargo technician on Vethara Station be made available for 2 weeks at Sector Station 9 to assist with the initial reserve adjustment." Mace looked at the abstract again. Calibrated interspecies stability. He thought about the wolf pup, which had been called Dusk by his mother, and which had, in the 8 months they'd had it, managed to knock over 4 fence posts, chew through a significant length of electrical conduit, and steal a pair of work gloves so beloved by his father that the loss had generated more commentary than any other single event in Mace's remembered childhood. He thought about the specific quality of the animal's eyes when it had finally stopped trembling in the barn and gone to sleep. That shift from frightened to just tired, from frightened to safe. "I'd need the time credited against the seasonal contract," he said. Commander Vethai's limbs did a thing that Mace had never seen Cathari limbs do before. He thought it might be relief. "That," she said, "can be arranged." He went to Sector Station 9 at the end of the freight week. He was there for 16 days, not 14, because the initial adjustment took longer than projected. He sat in the reserve acclimatization bay with the cub while the wildlife team ran their protocols. And the cub was calmer than anyone had seen a newly arrived Vareth at the reserve, calmer, by the kind of margin that the team lead said, carefully, she'd need to include in her own report. On the 15th day, the pack integration team made first contact from the far end of the enclosure, and the cub went toward them the way a lost thing goes toward home, with the specific quality of motion that is not quite running because running would say that there was fear behind it, but is also not walking because walking would say that it didn't matter. And what it was instead was something in between that had no word in any language Mace knew, except maybe the one his mother had used when she described the wolf pup the morning they'd released it. Glad. He watched from the observation panel. The Pellish coordinator was beside him, all 4 antennae extended, 3 recording devices running. "How does it feel," the coordinator asked, "to watch that?" Mace thought about it for a while. Outside, the cub reached the pack and there was a complex, rapid series of vocalizations and contact gestures that the team lead, over the comm, was narrating in technical language that he mostly didn't follow. "Like when a repair finishes," he said finally. "When the system comes back online and the diagnostic clears, that's the thing I can compare it to." The coordinator was quiet for a moment. All 4 antennae tilted slightly toward him. "That is an interesting comparison," it said. "Yeah," Mace said. He watched the cub settle into the pack, watched the pack close around it in the slow, deliberate way of a group of beings that recognized a returned member and were doing the work of reintegration in real time. Probably not how the paper's going to say it. Probably not, the coordinator agreed. Outside, the cub's inner eyes found the observation panel one more time, just for a moment. Then it turned, and the pack moved, and the distance between them and the panel grew until they were shapes in the middle of the enclosure rather than individual things, and then they disappeared behind the line of the habitat's terrain features. Mace stood at the panel for another minute. Then he unclipped his diagnostic tool from his belt, checked the charge out of habit, clipped it back. "All right," he said. "I've got a regulator housing on Vethara Ring 4 that's been broken for 16 days. He turned and walked toward the transit bay. Behind him, he heard the coordinator following, and the soft sound of 3 recording devices that were still running. The environmental regulator on docking Ring 4 had been running at 62% capacity since the 3rd week of the freight season, and Mace had been fighting a losing battle with station maintenance to get the replacement components authorized for the entire 4 months he'd been on Vethara. The problem was bureaucratic rather than technical. The components existed in the station's warehouse inventory. He'd confirmed this personally on week 2, but releasing them required a sign-off from the Ring 4 system supervisor, who was a Cathari named Veth Sauron, who was either enormously overworked or enormously disinterested in cargo bay environmental systems, and who had, in 4 months, responded to exactly 3 of the 14 maintenance requests Mace had filed. The 3 responses had all said, in slightly different words, that the Ring 4 systems queue was currently prioritizing pressurization integrity, and that cargo bay environmental regulators fell under Category C maintenance, which had a standard turnaround of 8 to 12 weeks. Mace had been in enough bureaucratic systems on enough stations and haulers across enough years to know what Category C maintenance meant. It meant, we will get to this when there is nothing more important to get to, and there is always something more important. So he'd been doing what experienced cargo technicians did with broken systems, managing it, rerouting airflow from adjacent bays to compensate for the reduced output, adjusting the load distribution on the Bay 7 thermal regulators to pick up the slack, running manual spot checks twice a shift to make sure the cargo being stored in Bay 7, which currently included a shipment of temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical compounds bound for Sector Station 12, stayed within its transit specification. It was the kind of workaround that took 3 times as much effort as just fixing the thing would have, but it was working, and Mace had learned early that working was the only metric that actually mattered in freight. He'd been elbow-deep in the workaround when the alarm went off. Now he stood in the regulator housing and picked up where he'd left off, and the numbers on the diagnostic screen were exactly what they'd been 16 days ago, which meant the workaround was holding, which was good, and the regulator was still at 62%, which was frustrating, and someone had apparently filed a Priority 1 maintenance override on his Ring 4 system's request while he was at Sector Station 9, which was. He looked at the screen again to confirm that he was reading it correctly, actually astonishing. He pulled up the override authorization trail on his secondary screen. The Priority 1 override had been filed 6 days ago by Station Commander Vethis. The authorization code attached to it was a commander's discretionary, which was the kind of authorization that station commanders were technically empowered to use, and practically never did, because it generated paperwork that required review by sector administration and created a flag in the commander's operational efficiency record. To use a commander's discretionary on a Category C cargo bay environmental regulator maintenance request was, in the context of station management bureaucracy, roughly equivalent to deploying emergency services to fix a dripping faucet. The replacement components were already staged in Bay 7's prep alcove. He could see them from where he was standing. He stood there for a moment looking at them. Then he looked at the diagnostic screen. Then he picked up his wrench. The formal interview with the Pelish coordinator, whose name, Mace had by now learned, was something that the translator rendered as vessel of the 16th careful observation, which was apparently a conventional Pelish name structure, and not some kind of title, took place over a series of sessions across the following 3 weeks, an hour each, in a meeting room on Vethara's administrative level that the coordinator had requisitioned specifically because it had better acoustics for recording. Mace had agreed to the interviews partly because Commander Vethais had asked him to, as a diplomatic courtesy, partly because the coordinator was genuinely interesting to talk to in the specific way that people who were deeply expert in something he'd never thought about were interesting, and partly because the coordinator had brought, to the first interview, a copy of Hartley's Comparative Xenobiology, 3rd edition, and had asked him to go through the sections on Varith behavioral taxonomy and annotate where his instinctive reads had matched the academic literature and where they diverged from it. Most of them matched. This surprised the coordinator. It did not particularly surprise Mace. The literature was written from observation, he said. You observe enough scared animals, you learn what scared looks like. But you have not observed Varith, the coordinator said. You had never encountered one before. No, but scared is scared. He thought about it for a moment. The specifics were different. The indicators I was reading weren't the same ones I'd read on a horse or a dog, but the underlying thing, the pattern of a frightened animal that hasn't committed to fleeing or fighting yet, that reads the same. The weight shift, the attention quality, the way it was holding itself. He paused. Honestly, the biggest indicator was what it wasn't doing. Explain. It wasn't moving. It wasn't vocalizing aggressively. It wasn't taking up more space. Those are all things a Varith adult does when it's in threat mode. The literature is pretty clear on that. The territory marking, the threat display, the pre-attack stillness is a different quality than the post-alarm stillness. This one was just sitting there. He shrugged. Sitting in the middle of a room and not doing anything is a very specific thing. It's what a lost animal does when it's run out of ideas. The coordinator wrote something in its notation system, a complex pattern of filament movements that Mace had learned to read as engaged recording rather than passive recording, which was a slightly different configuration of the front 2 antennae. You said scared is scared, it said. The Confederation's official xenobehavioral literature contains approximately 240 years of documentation on Varith behavioral states. The dominant framework positions Varith behavioral patterns as highly species-specific and resistant to cross-species interpretation. You arrived at an accurate read in less than 30 seconds. To be fair, May said, I read Hartley first. You read Chapter 9, the metabolic rate section. That was the only chapter you referenced by name. I've read more of it than that, he said. I've been on freight haulers for 8 years. You read What Might Try to Kill You. And yet experienced Confederation personnel who have also read the relevant literature and who had significantly more time to assess, did not make the same read. Mace thought about how to say what he wanted to say. He thought about his father, who had not been a man who explained himself much and who had, on the specific question of animals and the reading of them, said almost nothing directly. The knowledge had been transferred through proximity, through watching, through the hours in the barn with the wolf pup and the years with the horses and the accumulated texture of a childhood in which animals were not a separate thing from life, but were just part of it. The way water was part of it, the way weather was part of it. Not a subject to study, just a thing that was there and that you learned to read because you were in it all the time. I don't know how to answer that, he said, except to say that most people don't spend very much time around animals, and the ones who do, mostly in this part of the galaxy, they're spending time with domesticated ones, lab animals, freight animals in transit housing, controlled situations, animals that are already in a frame where human interaction is normal. He paused. I grew up with animals that had no frame. The wolf pup had never been domesticated. The hawk had never been in a barn. You learn something different from those ones. You learn, the coordinator said, what a frightened thing looks like before the frame exists. He looked at it. Yeah. I think that's probably it. The coordinator's antennae went into the configuration he still didn't have a name for, the one from the cargo bay when he'd said paying attention. 3 weeks after the interviews concluded, the paper was published. 2 weeks after that, Mace received, via Commander Vethais, who appeared to find the entire situation somewhere between professionally bewildering and genuinely entertaining, a formal communication from the Confederation Xenobiological Studies Institute at Central Station, which was the single most prestigious xenobiology research institution in the Confederation, and was located approximately 40 light-years from where Mace was currently adjusting a cargo manifesting system in Bay 3. The communication was an invitation. Specifically, an invitation to speak at the Institute's annual symposium on interspecies communication, which was scheduled for approximately 8 months from now and which was, Commander Vethais informed him with the careful emphasis of someone translating the significance of something into terms a person unfamiliar with the context would understand. Something like the largest gathering of xenobehavioral scientists in the known galaxy. He read the invitation twice. He read it a third time. They want a cargo technician to speak at their symposium, he said. They want, Commander Vethais said, the person in the documented footage. The symposium committee's communication to me was very specific. They want the person, not a representative or a proxy. They want you to describe what you did and why, in your own words, to the symposium audience. I told the coordinator what I did and why, Mace said. It's in the paper. The paper, Commander Vethais said, is 7,000 words plus 23 pages of appendices. The symposium committee feels that there is something in the footage that the paper does not fully capture, and that the person who can capture it is the one who was in the footage. Mace looked at the invitation again. He thought about standing in front of a room full of the Confederation's foremost xenobiologists and saying the words, I grew up with animals. My dad had a wolf pup. Scared is scared. My contract runs another 3 months, he said. The symposium is in 8 months. I'd need a new contract after this one. Commander Vethais looked at him steadily. The Institute's invitation includes a stipend, a significant one. My understanding is that it would cover a gap between contracts without any difficulty. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the bay viewport, a Kethari freight team was running the afternoon resupply transfer, moving cargo containers from a mid-sized hauler that had docked that morning. He watched them work, the practiced efficiency of a crew that had done this 10,000 times, the container movements that looked fluid from a distance and were actually dozens of micro-adjustments, the communication that happened in gestures and rhythm rather than words. He'd worked freight teams like this for 8 years. He knew what that efficiency looked like from the inside, how it became invisible to you once you were in it, how you stopped seeing the skill because the skill was just how the thing was done. He thought about the Pelish coordinator asking, "What is the word for what you did?" "I'll think about it," he said. Commander Vethais's limbs did the thing again. The thing he decided to just call relief, because that's what it looked like, and because he'd learned in 4 months that reading what a thing looked like was usually more accurate than reading what you expected it to look like. He thought about it for the remainder of the freight season, which was another 11 weeks, during which he fixed the Ring 4 environmental regulator completely. The replacement components worked. The pharmaceutical shipment made Sector Station 12 within specification. Vethsaran sent him a Category C maintenance completion notice that had the slightly dazed quality of someone who was not entirely sure how a Priority 1 override had gotten attached to their queue. Worked 14 transit animal handling requests that came to him via Commander Vethais, because apparently his availability for transit animal management had become part of the station's informal operational infrastructure. Read the rest of Hartley's comparative xenobiology, and then the 3 texts the Pellish coordinator had sent him as supplemental material after the interviews, and had approximately 140 conversations with various station personnel about the incident, most of which ended with some version of the same question. Why weren't you afraid? He thought about that question for 11 weeks too. The honest answer was that he had been afraid. The heartbeat kick-up was real. The prickling at the back of the neck when the cub touched its sensory pits to his knee was real. Fear was not the thing that was absent. The thing that was absent was the fear's ability to make the decision. Those were 2 different things, and he'd spent a long time in his life learning to keep them separate, long enough that the separation had become automatic, which might be why it didn't look like something from the outside. He thought about how to say that. He thought about the symposium and the room full of xenobiologists and the question of what to actually tell them. He thought about his father, who would have found the entire situation, his kid at a Confederation Science Symposium, talking about what he'd learned in a Montana barn, either hilarious or right, or both. In the 8th week of the 11, he sent the Institute a reply accepting the invitation. The coordinator, who had departed Vethara at the end of its fellowship 6 weeks earlier and was now back at its home institution in the Pellish system, sent him a brief message when the Institute's confirmation notice went out. It said, "I have been asked by the symposium committee whether you will require a translator for your remarks. I told them I did not think you would. The things you have to say do not require translation. They require only the saying." He read it twice. Then he clipped the diagnostic tool to his belt, which was something he did every morning, and went back to work. The Vareth cub sent no messages. It was, by the latest reserve update, fully pack-integrated and ranging normally. In the behavioral notes from the reserve team, there was a single line about its adjustment period that read, "Subject displayed unusually rapid stress recovery and above-average socialization uptake following initial adjustment period. Reserve staff attribute this to the quality of the transitional support environment." Mace read the reserve update on his break in the cargo bay, with a cup of bad station coffee going cold beside him. He read the line about the transitional support environment 3 times. Then he finished his coffee and went back to fixing things.